Hi and welcome to another of the DTA screencasts, and in this session we're going to be looking at ergogenic aids, and part 3 is about the physiological aids. Part 1 that we already looked at was nutritional aids, and part 2 was the pharmacological aids. Okay, so what is a physiological aid? That's the thing we've got to try and work out. So in essence it's moving from this to this. Alright, now you might say that there are a lot of other methods of doing that, but using these aids you can increase the rate of the adaptation by the body to increase the performance. Some are illegal, some are legal, but there are moral issues with that as well. Alright, so let's take a look. One of the examples that most people would know is blood doping. So what is blood doping? Well, it's the removal of blood in training prior to an event, and then the body's very clever. What it does is adapt. So it creates the red blood cells that have been lost, which obviously carry the oxygen to the working muscles. Then once the event is just about to take place, you reinsert that blood back into the body. So this gives you more red blood cells and therefore more ability to carry oxygen to the working muscles. And what you could argue is that you could then last longer. It can increase your aerobic capacity. Now, there's a very famous person, I'm sure most of you have heard of, who used this method, and it was Mr. Lance Armstrong within the Tour de France. So, the benefits of blood doping are increased red blood cells and hemoglobin, increase O2 transport, increase the aerobic capacity, and therefore increase the duration and the intensity before you actually get fatigued. But with everything, there are risks as well. So there is increased blood viscosity, decreased cardiac output, increased risk of blood clots, and risk of transfusion infection. So the blood viscosity is how sticky your blood actually becomes, because it's a lot thicker. And then what happens is, because you're having to work a lot harder to move that blood around, you're going to decrease the cardiac output. And obviously, because there's more blood in there, you're going to increase this risk of blood clots. The transfusion infection is just because you're using or potentially sharing needles with people, and there may be such diseases as hepatitis or even HIV and AIDS. So quite a risk. All right, so let's take a look at another one. So the next one we can look at is the intermittent hypoxial training. In other words, altitude training, which is probably how most of you will have heard of it. So let's think about us down here at sea level. There's a certain amount of oxygen within the atmosphere, and it's under a certain amount of pressure. So let's assume that we call that the PSI. Now I know that at sea level the PSI is 14.7, and PSI stands for pounds per square inch. So that's the amount of pressure that's being forced upon the atmosphere at that level. Alright, now let's take us up here. What happens when we go to altitude? Well, there's less pressure. So if there's less pressure in the atmosphere, then there's less transfer of that O2, or a concentration of that O2 that's being then diffused or transferred into the working muscles. So let's just take a look at that here. So let's say that this is the atmosphere, and we've reduced the amount of O2 pressure that's within the atmosphere, so there is less going to transfer into the alveoli and therefore into each one of the red blood cells. Now, again, the body's a very clever thing, so what it does, it adapts. As before, it creates more hemoglobin, more red blood cells to make up for the loss of the O2. So it's making more of these and hopefully trying to transfer more blood to the working muscles. Alright, now, what happens is then, when you then come back down to sea level, you've got loads and loads of hemoglobin, loads of red blood cells. Therefore, you're able to actually perform better because of the red blood cells and the hemoglobin. So there's an increase in performance. Now, one of the problems is going up to mountainous areas is a pretty expensive thing. So instead of travelling there and then working there, people have come up with ingenious ways of simulating an atmosphere. So they reduce the amount of O2 that you're being given whilst you're actually exercising. Now, it's a very clever way of doing it, because if you think, if you're at a high altitude, it's actually quite hard to train because of the lack of oxygen. So therefore you get fatigued. So the argument is that you need to train at sea level but rest at a reduced atmospheric pressure. So people have come up with these ingenious tents. Let's have a look at these. So you would train at sea level, so you can train as per normal, the same amount of hours, 6 hours, 8 hours a day. But then when you're resting, you're reducing the amount of oxygen you're receiving, and therefore you're creating that hypoxia. What your body will do is adapt and create more red blood cells, and therefore create more opportunity to transfer O2. And that in essence is what we're talking about. The ability to increase the aerobic capacity for an endurance event. So let's look at the benefits. Now, acclimatization, if you're going to do an event at altitude, increase in red blood cells, increase in the ability to carry O2, and therefore increase the delay of onset blood lactic acid. Now notice how we separate each one of those points, try not to condense them all into one, break it down, and obviously you're showing the examiner you've got an extensive knowledge and also scoring more points. But risks, you lose the benefits very quickly. You may lose motivation, and as we mentioned, it's hard to reach normal work rates at altitude, but these tents here get round that. There's also decreased immune function as well. Alright, so let's move on to the last one then that we're going to look at, and that's cooling aids. Some of these are pretty straightforward, and there are three main sections: pre, injury, and post cooling aids. So, cooling vests. These are like cooling collars. You can just put them around you prior to the activity. These ones I'm sure most of you will recognise, which is the ice and the good old cold spray. And these are the injury-based ones. And then last but not least, some of you may have experienced this, but there's good old Mo Farah jumping into an ice bath. And there's research about this saying that if you're getting bumps and bruises, they're a good idea, but not for every single event. Alright, so let's look at the benefits of each one of those. So, reducing core temperature is obviously going to reduce the amount of sweating that you perform, and therefore reduce the amount of dehydration. So for the sprays and the cool or the ice packs, you're decreasing pain in the injury and potentially swelling. Yeah, and hopefully what you're trying to do is then increase the speed of recovery, and you're reducing DOMS. Alright, now, risks. Difficult to perceive the exercise intensity at the very beginning. So how cold do you want that person actually to be? How much ice do you need to give them prior to? The other thing as well is ice burns. If you put a pack on you, you can't keep it on your skin. So there's one of the smaller issues, but a nice easy point to score. By doing all of these things, the sprays and the ice rubs, is you're hiding the injury. So you might actually be creating more of a problem than preventing one. And last but not least, and quite an extreme example here, is it's dangerous for people with heart conditions. Now, that's not an ice pack, but if you've got somebody with a heart condition jumping in there, it could be a jolt to the system, using quite a crude term, and therefore you do try and steer clear of those types of activities if you have a heart condition. All right, so there are the physiological aids that we have. Go back over the screencast if you need to, have a look, pause it, and then check out the ASH PE webpage if you need more information. Okay, thanks very much.